The question from that day still came back to me from time to time. If I keep losing money, then who is making money in this market? The stock I had just bought was still in my portfolio, below my cost basis. Every time I opened my account, I found myself staring at that number a little longer before turning back to the notes I had used when choosing the stock. Everything I had learned, the criteria I had set, reasons I had decided to buy. They were all still there on the screen. I went through them one by one, trying to figure out what I might have missed. One trade not going the way I expected wasn't enough for me to reject everything I had just learned. The method wasn't necessarily wrong. There was simply something I was still missing, something I couldn't see yet. A few days later, a notice appeared about the company's annual shareholders meeting. In previous years, I hadn't paid much attention to meetings like this. I could read the annual report at home. The business plan would eventually be published, and any important information would sooner or later appear on financial websites. But this time, I stayed on the notice a little longer. If what I was missing wasn't in the books or on the charts, maybe I needed to see what people who had been investing for years actually cared about when they looked at a company. I registered for the meeting. On the morning of the meeting, the area outside the hall was already crowded. Small groups stood near the reception tables, holding the documents they had just received. Some were reading as they walked. Others had already opened to certain pages and were discussing the numbers with the people beside them. I collected my documents, went inside, and chose a seat somewhere near the middle of the hall. On stage, the management team sat behind a long table. A large screen behind them displayed the agenda for the evening. I opened the documents on my lap, looked around the room, then lowered my eyes back to the numbers in front of me. Most of the people sitting around me were complete strangers, but the way they were reading those documents made me curious. One person kept highlighting certain lines in the report. Another kept flipping back and forth between two pages, as though comparing something. The presentation began with the company's results from the previous year. Revenue, profit, assets, projects currently underway, and plans for the year ahead. One by one, the numbers appeared on the screen. I had already seen most of them while reading the reports at home. Sometimes I looked up at the screen. Sometimes I looked down at the documents to find the exact line being discussed. Everything still felt fairly familiar, until the discussion began. A shareholder near the front stood up and asked about the effectiveness of an investment project currently underway. While management answered, I quickly flipped through several pages before finally finding the number he had mentioned. Another shareholder asked why revenue had increased while profit margins had changed. The next question went into cash flow and an item I had read before, but barely stopped to think about. I started taking notes, not only the answers from management. I also wrote down the questions themselves. We were all looking at the same report, the same numbers I could read myself, but somehow, these people seemed to see connections I had never thought about before. Some questions I understood immediately. Others made me search through the documents again. Sometimes the person asking the question took the microphone a second time because the first answer still hadn't addressed what they really wanted to know. I kept looking from the person asking the question, down to the pages in my hands, then back up at the site, trying to keep up with the conversation. A man sitting a few rows away from me barely took part in the conversations around him. His documents were already covered with markings. When the moderator invited the next question, he raised his hand. The microphone was passed to him. He stood and looked toward the management team. Management has just presented a very clear 5-year plan, but the past few years have shown us how quickly the world can change. We've been through a pandemic, wars, political and economic upheaval in the United States, while Vietnam's economy continues to be heavily influenced by external markets. I stopped writing. The man continued. So I would like to ask one question. If, 2 or 3 years from now, a major event occurs that none of us can predict today, and that event causes the 5-year plan to fall off course, what has management prepared to respond to it? If there is a plan, could you explain it more specifically? For a few brief seconds, no one said anything. and one member of the management team picked up the microphone. He said it was difficult to create a specific plan for an event that no one today could know in advance. What a company could prepare for was not every possible crisis. It was the ability to adapt when circumstances change. From there, the answer became more specific: how the company controlled its debt, how it maintained cash flow, how it avoided becoming too dependent on a single market, and how it could adjust the pace of its investments if business conditions became less favorable. Another member of management picked up the microphone and continued, talking about the long-term plan, the markets the company was expanding into, and how its strategy could be adjusted if the business environment changed. I looked down at the notebook in front of me. The man's question was still there. In the months before that meeting, whenever I thought about a stock, my attention usually went to the purchase price. How much I expected it to rise, where I would sell, or what signal might tell me that my decision was probably right. But that man was asking about something that might happen 2 or 3 years from now. And the people on stage were talking about a plan that stretched 5 years into the future. I looked over at him. He had already sat down and was quietly flipping through his documents, as though the question he had just asked was nothing unusual. The discussion continued, but from that moment on, I wasn't listening the same way anymore. When a shareholder asked about an expansion plan, I didn't just write down the amount of capital involved. I started paying attention to why that person cared about it. When someone else mentioned export markets, I searched through the report to see what detail might have led them to ask that question. There were still things I didn't fully understand, but instead of skipping over them, I marked them so I could read more when I got home. The pages of my notebook gradually filled with writing. Numbers that had once stood alone in the report were now connected to questions about cash flow, markets, competitive strength, and years that hadn't even arrived yet. I had come here hoping to find out what my method was missing, but the longer I listened, the more I felt that what I didn't know was much bigger than a few rules about buying and selling. Near the end of the meeting, the company's 5-year plan appeared on the screen again. Targets for revenue, profit, markets, and upcoming projects stretched across the years ahead. I looked at them longer than I had before. Then, without meaning to, I thought about the stock sitting below my cost basis in my account. I had spent days thinking about a few weeks of price movement, while the people in this room were talking about 3 years, 5 years. When the meeting ended, people began gathering their documents and making their way toward the exit. I stayed in my seat a little longer, flipping through the pages of notes I had just written. I didn't know the name of the man who had asked that question. He had already disappeared into the crowd leaving the hall, but his question was still there, among the lines in my notebook. I picked up my documents and stood. As I walked toward the exit, conversations continued around me. Some people were discussing profit targets. Others were talking about dividends. 2 people walking ahead of me were discussing one of the projects that had just been presented. I walked behind them and thought about the way the shareholders in that room had looked at a company. They weren't only asking what the stock price would do tomorrow. Some were thinking about 2 years from now, 3 years from now, even about things that hadn't happened yet. That image stayed with me the entire way home. If I understood the company I owned well enough, maybe I wouldn't need to worry about every rise and fall in its share price. If I could look beyond the next few weeks, perhaps the fluctuations in front of me wouldn't matter as much as I once thought. I remembered the man with the heavily marked documents. I remembered his question about an event that might happen years in the future. And I remembered how calmly he had sat back down after asking it. I wanted to be able to look at a company that way someday. Not just know whether a stock was going up or down, but understand what I actually own, how the company made money, where it wanted to go, and what might happen along the way. I wanted enough patience not to change my decision because of a few trading sessions, and enough understanding to see beyond the numbers flashing on the screen every day. I had found what was missing. It wasn't another indicator. It wasn't another entry. What I needed was to learn how to look at a company over a longer period of time. Like the people I had met that day. Over the following weeks, The stock remained below my cost basis. Some days it rose a little, then fell again. There were days when the overall market performed quite well, while the stock I owned barely moved. Whenever that red number appeared, I opened the annual report again. I looked at the projects underway, or I went back through the documents I had brought home from the shareholders meeting. The 5-year plan was still there, along with the targets management had presented in front of hundreds of shareholders. One evening, I opened the marked pages again and carefully reread the section on the company's long-term plans. If those projects were completed on schedule, if revenue and profit followed the path the company had laid out, then a few weeks of falling prices really didn't seem like much compared with the road ahead. I closed the documents, looked at my portfolio one more time, then turned off the screen. A few more weeks passed. The price still hadn't returned to where I had bought it. But I was no longer watching every trading session, waiting for it to get back to my cost basis. Some days, I didn't even open my portfolio until the market was about to close. I would look at the red number, then close it again. 3 years, 5 years. Those were the time frames I thought about now, more than tomorrow or next. The more I read about the company, the more I believed there was a reason behind my decision. Short-term price movements couldn't determine the value of a company years into the future. If I had chosen to invest in the business, then I also had to give the business time to do what it was trying to do. The stock was still in my portfolio. I was still holding it. But the feeling was different from those first days after the trade. Back then, I held because I wasn't ready to believe that my new method had led me to another wrong decision. Now, every time I looked at that stock, I remembered the shareholders meeting, the questions in the room, and the 5-year plan on the screen. I believed I was beginning to understand what long-term investing really meant, and this was the kind of investor I wanted to become. A few months passed. One afternoon, after barely looking at the stock for most of the trading session, I opened my portfolio. The familiar stock was still there, but the price made my hand stop on the mouse. I pulled up the chart and looked at the price line running across the past several weeks. The declines I had once thought were only short-term fluctuations had continued much longer than I expected. I looked over at my cost basis. The distance between the two numbers had become much larger. The documents from the shareholders meeting were still lying on the desk beside me. I pulled them closer and opened them to the pages I had folded at the corners. The 5-year plan was still there. The revenue targets, the profit targets, the projects, and the lines I had once underlined, all still there on the page. I looked back at the screen. The stock price had fallen much further than it had on the day I walked out of that shareholder